We're live.
I don't have my green screen yet. I ordered it, but as you can see, it hasn't. Oh, this is my chroma key background I chose.
Right.
It's pretty.
So Jeff Fritz has done that on his live stream. He's got a green screen, but then he's also got a picture of the wall behind him.
Oh.
It's amazing.
Okay.
So, I mean, he doesn't normally do it, but occasionally he's done this thing where, like, I'll be like, wait, I thought you had the green screen, and then I'll notice it actually is.
That's funny. He chroma keys himself onto the same background. That's a little funny. I might chroma key myself into your office.
Yeah, why not?
So
it's a great idea.
When I get the green screen, we shouldn't have spoiled it. I should have just done it one week. But now people who are watching early will see this.
Those 46 people, don't spoil it.
I won't say shh.
Yeah.
So welcome everybody. The 48 of you who are watching now, they're just trickling in. There's no Handsome this week, so we don't get his amazing power to reach out into the ether webs and have people come to the show. It's just us, but that's all right. We had a very successful show last week. The Blazer stuff went off.
It was great. That Blazer is so hot right now.
Yeah, Blazer is so hot right now. I think we did a pretty good job of promoting it. We had a lot of people. We had like 240 odd people watching live at one point, and we've had 4,000 views of that episode in a week, which is back to sort of mid last year numbers, which is fantastic. Back to the cool. Handsome and channel numbers. So
we're gonna have to have a cliffhanger where one of us falls down, we're having a heart attack, and then find out next week.
Well, I will say what we're going to be doing for the next few weeks, which I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago, is that the 2.1 release we've been talking about a lot is imminent. It's coming along. I'll give a status update in a little bit. And so we're going to be using the show to try and highlight sort of feature areas of 2.1. So today I'm going to try and give a very quick look at some of the little improvements we've made in Razor Pages in 2.1. So I'll do that today. There's not many of them, so it won't take long. Next week, we've got Javier on to look at the ability to put Razor in a class library and sort of the changes to the Razor compilation system that we've done in 2.1. So that'll be super cool. And then I think 2 weeks after, or a week after that, I'm supposed to be going over, I think, the HTTPS by default and the HTTPS configuration improvements that we've made, and the cookie consent and stuff like that in the templates. Then the week after that, I think we have Ryan Novak back on from the MVC team, and he was going to go through the API controller attribute and the improvements that brings, including an API result of T, the conventions around auto validation of model state, better errors for the deserialization errors on input, things like that. Stuff we've done for web APIs, basically. And then I think it's me again talking about something. And then after that, all the way through into March something, is Sarab, who will be talking about the improvements to the ASP.NET Core module that is hosting ASP.NET Core in IIS. So a look at the in-process hosting model and how people can try that out in Preview 1. Because it will not be on by default in Preview 1. You're going to have to sort of do some work to use it, but we would like people to try it and let us know before we ship the Preview 2. So anyway, the next...
Do we have one lined up for SignalR? We had some people ask about SignalR.
Well, we already had a SignalR one not long ago.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I guess
so we had Pavel on and talked about SignalR Core.
Right.
I don't know, only 5 or 6 weeks ago, I think, before he left. Yeah, so, I mean, we could do another one after that, but SignalR gets a lot of coverage. I'd like to try and rotate some other stuff through.
The reason I thought of that one was recently someone pinged me on Twitter and it's like, when is SignalR going to be? And I'm like, oh, man, people might not know, but I think our viewers do.
Right. Yeah. So SignalR is part of 2.1. I'll just reiterate it. It was in the blog post. I mean, did we talk about the blog post? I wasn't here that week. It was, did Dan or you bring it up? Okay, good. So the roadmap post went out.
But, it wouldn't hurt to, why don't we, when we finish up our links,
I'll bring up that
post. Yeah.
So let's go to John Loves Community.
Let's do that. Okay. And here we go. Not a huge amount today. But I will start. So we were talking about Blazor.
Have you locked yourself on? You're locked on. You're locked on.
I'm about to be locked on. I need a big thing that just flashes on my screen.
We need buttons we can send each other.
Yeah.
Hand messages.
Right. So you mentioned Blazor. Here's the deep, in-depth technical introduction Steve Sanderson wrote up, and here he kind of explained all this stuff. Here's how it actually works. Here's how it loads. stuff you might not, realize. Like I naively at the very beginning of this, first time I poked at it, was thinking everything was getting turned into WebAssembly. No, that's not true. The WebAssembly is loading and running your MSIL and
Your
stuff.
IL, that's right.
Yep. So, I mean, just all the kind of, this is everything you need to know, the deep kind of technical, here's how it loads and stuff. He also kind of, towards the end, goes into, things like JavaScript, TypeScript interop, which is very cool. And then talking about some optimization, here's things that can happen in the future as far as optimizing. So this is, like you mentioned, it's very cool to, if you haven't seen it, watch last week's community stand-up where we had live demos going into Blazor, but then this is more kind of deep technical stuff, way more detail than we got into last week. So very cool. This is a link that you sent me, Damian. This is from Bipin Joshi. He has been writing, I just got to call him out. He's somebody we've been featuring for years. He's been writing quality content on ASP.NET going back for a very long time. So this post specifically is on Ajax performing CRUD operations with Razor pages. And the thing that I pulled out of this, and Damian, since you sent it to me, feel free to interrupt and call out more, but I liked, first of all, that he kind of does a full walkthrough. Here's how I'm creating the context and model and stuff. He talks about how he's mapping the, things like onGet, onPost to CRUD operations that make sense for Ajax.
Mm-hmm.
So, creating things like onGet select all, onGet select by ID, and then
he's using the named handler feature. Exactly for what it was intended, the ability to be able to have multiple handlers that you can differentiate per command. There's a couple of things I would tweak about this if I was to give feedback, but overall it's a good explanation and a good example of how you could use the Razor pages primitives for you can extend them. You can do sort of other stuff with we don't have a first class JSON response type because we're like it's not really idiomatic to return JSON from your page model, but you can because any action result will get executed. So you can absolutely have an Ajax endpoint, essentially, that you call from JavaScript and return JSON. It'll just work. And as you can see here, it does. And you can keep all the code in sort of one place. So it's kind of cool.
One question I had on this, here he called this on delete delete. That struck out a little weird to me. I would have thought maybe just call that on delete. Is there a reason that jumps out?
No, I think the only reason is because he's genericized kind of the handler. He hard-coded the handler name suffix into the client side. So he's passing through the named handler as a query string parameter. And I'm assuming that he didn't want to have to differentiate those operations which required a named handler and those that didn't. Because on delete would just execute if a delete verb was sent to the server,
right.
So that's where he says it goes to insert handler equals blah up the top there. Handler equals insert, handler equals blah. Now, it turns out it's actually not super generic. He's done it in each button handler, so he could have done it that way, but then it wouldn't be potentially consistent. Either is fine. I think that's all just like whatever the person decides. None of that is something you can't change or have an effect on. So that's just opinion at that point.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the only thing I would change, the thing I was talking about was he's passing the handler through as a query string argument, and the client side is hard coding that. Using the routing and the named route parameters, you can have that go through as a segment part of the URL as the path rather than as a query string variable. Both will work. Like if you pass handler through the query string and you marked it in the segment in your route as optional, it should still dispatch, but you can set it up such that it would all be sort of, it would just honor what you had configured the page to do. And rather than hard coding the URLs in JavaScript, what I typically like to do is emit them into the HTML in data dash variables, using the URL helpers. So again, they always honor what your router is set up to do. And then you harvest those from the JavaScript by grabbing them out of the data dash variables and then use them that way. So you don't have to do with this hard coded in URL stuff. But other than that, there's nothing wrong with this approach.
Cool. Okay. So this is a nice one from Damian Bowden. It's here. What he's done is he looked at security. So first of all, he did a scan of a site and noticed it was recommending setting some security headers, things like strict transport security, content security policy, etc. He used a package, nwebsec.
Yep, that's the one we generally recommend people use, I believe.
Great. Okay. So he went through and used that and then showed how by just configuring, a lot of it is just saying, turn it on. There are some where he went through and set specific, specific options for that. Then went through and then, everything's green. So, I mean, there's definitely more detail here. And he does link out to specifically why you'd want to. That's one thing that I always like with his posts is he gives a lot of kind of footnotes at the end. So towards the end of this, he's got plenty of links. There was also some good discussion on Twitter. I think Barry Dorans and other folks commented back and said, hey, I don't use this, or, right. I recommend that. So he went through and made several updates afterwards.
And again, I will say that, this is great that we're seeing these type of posts. We did a blog post recently about configuring the site for HTTPS on the 2.0 APIs, and frankly, it was kind of horrible, but we did it because we know Chrome has moved or is imminently moving to marking pages that aren't HTTPS as non-secure if you're doing data entry. And then in 2.1, as I've mentioned, we're going to support HTTPS by default on new projects, and we have some new middleware and some new experiences that make that better. Over time, I think you'll see us do more for that as well. Some of these things are a little hard to do by default because they require you to think carefully about, like things like content security policy, and some of the other ones there require have an effect on the features of your application if you're not aware of them. And so just doing them by default out of the box with a default policy can be a little intrusive. But we continue to look at ways that we can just improve and ratchet up the default security status of all new ASP.NET Core apps. The first one is ASP.NET Core is HTTPS with HSTS in 2.1. We'll continue to look at things that we can do moving forward.
Cool. Okay. So here's one from Jeremy Campbell, and he's writing here specifically about Blue Milk. So he's always got interesting names for things. Blue Milk is an OSS. It does a few things. It is an inversion of control tool. It's also it follows a lot of conventions, is pretty similar to Structure Map. So if you've got Structure Map, this is a .NET Standard 2.0 kind of replacement for that. And then it does a lot of interesting things with Roslyn, like built-in generation. So he's doing a lot of things with generation of code, specifically for like words not working, following conventions. So basically he's got
breathe.
Yeah.
We'll get you through this.
Yeah, well, there's a lot here. This one's pretty interesting. So here he's got some kind of standard default conventions, and then based on that, he'll generate code for you and work with IOC. So honestly, I've read through this. I would need to play with it a bit more to kind of understand in more detail. But I do like how Jeremy's working to build both like opinionated, convention-based things, but he works specifically so that this integrates well with the ASP.NET Core DI system.
Right.
So this is built for kind of a drop-in, here's how you can use it with ASP.NET Core. So, pretty cool. AtomStore, this is pretty straightforward here. He has built out something using webhooks, and here he's built out a sample using Azure Alert webhooks. So he shows how to configure Azure Alerts.
This is using the new webhooks, the ASP.NET Core stuff. Yep.
Very cool. So this is using that, and then he shows also how to test it locally. So configuring secrets, how to configure secrets correctly, and then also how to test it out locally with Azure Alerts, and then hooking that all up with the new webhooks.
Cool
stuff. This one is interesting here. So about T4 MVC. This goes back a long way with David Ebo, and so this was using T4 based code generation to eliminate strings in your code. So the idea was with ASP.NET MVC, T4 templates would generate hard-coded things so that you could, get rid of all the strings. And yep. So, and a lot of this is like, how do you feel about it? What do you like? But I definitely see the I do tend to try and get rid of strings where I can without going overboard, because if a string misspelling is something you won't catch until you hit a unit test or whatever, right? So the idea here is replacing HTML.partial and then in quotes dinner form with something like this.
Interesting.
So what this is doing, this is R4 MVC. This is a Roslyn powered code generator. And the idea is that this, you have a command that you run. So this is a PowerShell command, and it generates code. And then, so it's not using T4 templates. It's using a Roslyn powered generator. And then it'll give you kind of hard-coded things that you can then strongly typed refer to things. As you'll see here, this is a small scroll bar here. He's got tons of, there's a lot of documentation here. So
I wonder how this will work alongside the new Razor build stuff that's going to happen in 2.1, where we're going to default to building Razor at build time. It'll still be a sort of a companion assembly. It won't be in your application assembly, so you still can't reference views by type. But yeah, this is an interesting approach.
Yeah. Cool. All right. This is coming up this Friday. Jeff Fritz had a thing as he started his live stream. He's been doing live streaming several days a week. I think he just did one this morning. Today he was looking at the difference between partial views and view components, but he's been doing a lot of just different live coding, ASP.NET, showing people how to, do stuff with Git and GitHub, all kinds of stuff. So he kind of issued a challenge. He said, hey, if we hit 500 followers, we're going to give a free, big ASP.NET Core workshop.
Wow.
So yeah, so after hitting that, here's the thing for that. So that is this Friday. He talked me into co-presenting some sessions with him. We've got Shane Boyer. We've got Julie Lerman. He said possibly some others. I don't know if he's, tried to talk, folks on the team into it, but definitely he's, there's this will be a lot of fun. So there's more details coming.
Cool.
Yeah, the Bitly he set up a Bitly. It's I think. Let me make sure I get it right. I've got it in a window here. Bitly Fritz Workshop. So I'll be sharing this direct link. You can get to this. This is just out on his C# Fritz, out in his live stream repo. But yeah, so looking forward to that. And of course, it'll be recorded because it's going out on the live stream, and then it'll be up on his Twitch and Mixer stuff later. All right, Andrew Locke, continuing now. I will totally confess, some of this seems to be going over my head today. But what he did, he previously had looked at optimizing Docker builds using Cake, and he was talking about optimizing it so that he was pushing out to Docker Hub and doing as little kind of repeated work as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Here, what he's doing is, in order to optimize that, he wants to push out the CS proj files only, but not the rest of the code. And part of the reason for that is so that when he makes a change to a single file, like a CS file, it's not going to have to rebuild that Docker layer, that it's able to get as much Docker reuse as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And what he found as he was trying to do this is he first tried the naive solution and just tried to do a simple copy all the CS proj files over. What that ended up doing was dumping them all in the root.
Right.
So that
doesn't preserve structure.
Exactly. So what he ended up doing here was using a tar command. So he's doing creating a tarball that does preserve that structure. Docker, of course, being Unix-based, works pretty well with tar. So it's pretty easy afterwards to untar stuff. One interesting thing, by the way, is tar is now included in, I believe, let's show me wrong here. Yeah, so tar is included in Windows now, which is pretty cool. So tar and curl, a few other things are natively included now in Windows, which is pretty neat. So tar is available in Windows, is also available in Docker, and so he uses this tar command, creates that whole kind of structure with all the files that he wanted, and then expands them. After that, he's able to run .NET restore, and it goes through and does the proper restore for everything without having to copy the entire folder structure over. One other thing then, just to take it a little bit further, why not, is tarring other things. So he said, why don't we tar everything, including the solution and the NuGet config files. So that's what he's doing there. And then he shows, here's my, completed build script and Docker file. So
Sure.
I thought that was kind of interesting. And, just a way as you go through and optimize your build, this is a way to kind of streamline it. And then I think it actually finally made sense to me as I was explaining it more, but the idea of, you don't want to mess with your layers of your Docker file as much as possible, so that, because the way Docker works with layering, if you can avoid kind of changing the base structure, then changing, single files is won't cause that whole thing to rebuild.
Right.
So, yeah. Here's something I saw David Fowler tweet this past week. This is about that they've started putting up for grabs issues on Kestrel.
Nice.
So, neat. And I'm just reminded, going way back, when we first started doing these stand-ups, we said, like, hey, this stuff's open source, get involved. And one of the people that heard that was Ben Adams, and that's actually how he got inspired, was off this stand-up. So here, the next Ben Adams, please step up. Here you go. Here's Up for Grabs. And this is the whole idea with Up for Grabs tags is these are supposed to be issues where they're easy to kind of get started. These are ones that the team has looked at and figured out, like, hey, you're not going to get partway into this and find out that now you have to rewrite the entire parser or some crazy thing.
Yeah, it's more than that too. It's also things that we don't consider. I'm going to use my words carefully, or I won't, and then people can just infer what I mean. Like, they're obviously not important enough for us to just do. Like, we have other work that we are prioritizing above these items for the engineers here. Otherwise, we would just fix these bugs. If there were critical issues, we would fix them, obviously. But sometimes features, these three are bugs, but sometimes we have mild enhancements and things that fall into this as well. But you can see these have all been, like, 2 of them are triaged into the backlog milestone, which means that there is literally no commitment to ever do them. One of them is triaged into 2.2, which means that we want to circle back and consider it when we actually get to 2.2 planning, which means that we have no plan to do it in 2.1, and we may not do it in 2.2. But they're small enough, and as you said, they're simple enough. And importantly, I think they should have also determined that they're low impact. Like, if we do fix it or don't fix it, if we do fix it, it'll make the few people that it's annoying happy, but it's just not affecting enough people that warrants us going off and spending time on it, if that makes sense. And if someone does submit a PR for it to fix it, there's very low chance of it having a side effect that would then adversely impact a whole bunch more people. Because sometimes we have bugs that affect a small amount of people, it affects them severely, but if we were to fix that bug, it might be a breaking change for the vast majority of people. And so we have to always weigh those things when we look at determining what we fix and what we don't. So that's all the stuff that goes into Up for Grabs. And
as you've said, it's a lot more. There's a lot more that goes into this stuff than you'd think. Sometimes, like, I've had simple things in an open source repo where I'm like, oh yeah, I'll make it up for grabs, and somebody digs into it, and it's like, you might not have realized, but there's all these implications. And I've run into this too, where it's like, oh, I'll just fix this thing in this open source library, and like 6 hours later, I'm like regretting I ever learned the code.
Absolutely.
All right, one last one that I thought was interesting. And I forget actually this person's name. Let me see if we can find it quickly. I don't know this. Gosh. Anyhow, I saw this linked out. This was on. Yeah. All right. So you're BIRT for now. But this was on the front page of Hacker News this past week. Some interesting stuff in here. This is a kind of opinionated list of, here's some things that this person does for new ASP.NET Core projects. As I went through, I thought, some of this is stuff I'd turn on. Some of it was stuff I disagreed with. And I think that's a good way to look at this. This is one person's opinion of things that they like to do, kind of by default. So some things like, validating model state automatically.
Which we're doing in 2.1 in the API controller stuff.
Very cool. All right. So
which he actually calls out as well.
Okay, cool. Yep, there you go.
Yep.
So here's another thing, handling database exceptions globally. So
yeah, everyone argues about exception handling, right? So we could rat hole on that for a day.
Yeah. So some different things about there's some NuGet packages, for instance, that they pull in specifically. This is their own sorting, filtering, pagination NuGet package. So kind of cool. And then also their own authentication. Some of these things are interesting where it's like, well, I rewrote my own everything, you know. But I felt like this was kind of a good mix of some of those things that they like doing, and then some other specific, like I just like to turn this in by default. So
I mean, I liked it. There's a lot of very real stuff, and it's funny. These are always the posts that get a lot of comments because people look at this and go, "I don't do it that way. I do it this way." Or why would you ever do that? We don't do that in our apps. But like a lot of this stuff is literally, yeah. When we built this app, like there was one section there about changing the user during development, and I remember working in all types of apps where we'd have these companion tools that you would write specifically just to help you do stuff when you're coding, right? And you would be able to like set the entire site to run as this one user, or rewind this shopping cart 3 steps from wherever it currently is, or like you'd have all these crazy utilities that you'd write as a dev just to help you get your stuff done quicker. And some of these are just like make me think of that. It's like, yeah, like for the type of apps that I usually write, these things make a lot of sense. And the other thing I also used to say a lot to people was, you know, software craftsmanship is something that people talk about a lot, and you know, there's been various up and down movements around that. But I was always a bit advocate of, you know, if you can give up a few things that are like, you know, I really like things to work. If I could just change it to do this, I'd sleep so much better. I said, well, or you could just not die on that hill and just do it the way the framework wants you to do it, and you never have to worry about it again. Just like live with the fact that the framework wants you to live this way, and if you do, you're going to save yourself a crap load of time. That's not always true, obviously, but like, especially in web forms, there was a lot of things like that where, you know, people would never use the two-way data binding. Like it was more that because they started back when there wasn't those things, it was very difficult for them to move to them because they just never did that work. I think the same is true of any framework, right? Some people choose to not like things and they re-implement their own. That's fine. That's totally fine. But I do encourage people to at least have a look. Have a look at the way it wants you to do it. Think very hard about whether it's really worth you not doing it that way and replacing it with your own thing that you have to support yourself forevermore, and you have to and then it doesn't work with the rest of the framework for a particular reason, whatever it might be. So
yeah, I've come to deeply appreciate some developers are like that because they end up doing amazing things. Like sometimes an example there we talked about earlier, Jeremy Miller. I love that he continues to kind of push in different directions and work towards conventions he likes and build out things that tons of people have used. But there is, for, you know, Joe Development Shop, there's a cost to that, right? You've got to build out your own infrastructure. You've got to build out, and then you've got to support it, like you said, maintain it long term. And routinely, when I talk to people, and they'll say, "What do I need to do to upgrade from MVC3 to MVC4, and now from or like I've got a 2 versions ago app, and we've built this entire authentication system our own. How do I update it?" And I say, good luck, you know.
Especially an era like auth, which, you know, never changes ever. So once you do it, it'll be like that forever, right? Yeah. I mean, it's just like I said, all things, you know, assess, look at it, assess, make your own choices, but fully eyes open and understand what it's going to cost you either way. And now people are Nick is calling me up saying, well, of course you'd say that. You're the framework designer. Well, yeah, that's just true. I want people to get value from the things that we do.
Good to be king.
Yeah.
All right.
So I said I would give people a 2.1 update. So yeah, when I wasn't on the show last week, I think they would have talked about, we put out the 2.1 roadmap blog posts last week. .NET did one, EF did one, and ASP.NET Core did one. And we put a fair bit of effort into trying to cover most of the improvements that are planned for or actually have already been done for the upcoming 2.1 preview. With there's a couple of code samples and things like that. So if you haven't read that post, please go and do so now, or those posts, I should say. Some highlights, global tools for .NET Core. The command line is going to be cool. So you can now, very similar to NPM's global tools feature, you can write a .NET Core console app. You can pack it up as a tool, the NuGet package, and then anyone else with .NET Core installed can install that on their machine from the command line, and it goes onto the path for that user, and then they can invoke that tool. at any time. We'll be using that for some of the tools that we ship. So like .NET Watch, which is the command line project watching tool that you use when you're doing sort of iterative development at the command line or with VS Code, is now going to be a global tool in 2.1. We have a new global tool to do with managing developer certificates for the new HTTPS experience, which we'll look at in a couple of weeks. I think there's another one that we just watched over, probably a couple. I think there's like the tool that we use to set up the SQL tables for our distributed caching provider for SQL is now a global tool, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, we want folks to build their own tools. But today I was going to just do a very quick little bit of demos on the Razor pages improvements. There aren't many of them. Let me get my screen sharing going. But I wanted to quickly focus on that today. And as we said up front, people will be coming in to demo other stuff. So this is the blog post I was talking. This is the ASP.NET Core blog post. And this is the section on Razor pages improvements. So I was just going to quickly sort of demonstrate those. So over here, I have a 2.1 build installed. I was actually hoping to sneakily share with the 100 or so people watching how to get this build, because there are some folks using 2.1 now. It's quite difficult doing it the traditional way. We have a new build process that all the teams are working on that is going to hopefully solve a lot of our sort of reliability and coherence issues with getting and reliably getting a build sort of every day. And we've been using that internally, but we haven't yet sort of updated the public links that people are used to using to get nightlies for the .NET Core CLI. So, I mean, there are places you can get them, but the URLs are horrible. So like this is the URL for the latest one that I just installed, right? So this is product build 20180.209, which you can probably guess means it's February the 9th, third build that day, and then some other number on the end of it. And so, you know, this link here is literally to the Windows installer, and you can see the URL here. It is public. Like if you can find it, you can install it. It's just that this thing is not in a branch. Like it's literally in a random commit hash. So, you know, good luck finding it. But this will be updated shortly such that it'll be easier for people to consume these builds. And the great thing about these builds, like I said, is that they are coherent. You don't have to worry about getting an ASP.NET Core set of packages from here and a set of templates from there and a .NET Core runtime from there and then a matching CLI and SDK from over there. Like you literally install this thing on your, for your platform of choice, and everything inside that was built together. Right, so the ASP.NET Core templates use the right runtime, which use the right ASP.NET Core runtime, which depend on the right versions of the packages. It has the fallback folder / NuGet cache correctly, so you don't even need a feed if you just want to use the templates, and all that stuff just works. So this is going to make it much easier, and you know this will build every day. The whole idea is that this will be available, so you can always pick up the latest build. So I have that installed. I've used quite a few of these builds now, and this is what we're doing our validation on or our verification on. The hope, quickly, I'll interject, is that we will we are locking down this release right now. So our hope is that we're going to be able to get this out to folks in the next couple of weeks. We're pushing really hard. We've still got a couple of issues that we're working through, but you know that's our goal. So just so people have an understanding of where we are right now, we are trying to get this out in the next couple of weeks. So hold on, you'll be able to use these bits on official channels very soon. So I've created a new 2.1 app here. If I look in the CS Proj, I can prove that. So you can see here I am using. I targeted full framework, which I didn't mean to do. Let me change that. I was testing some full framework scenarios yesterday, and so it must have stuck there. See, I chose full framework. So let's do that again. .NET Core, because I actually wanted to see it using. Let's have a look. Let's open that. Right, so now it's using the new meta package that was announced a couple of weeks ago, and some folks online have been discussing. So ASP.NET Core.app, NetCore app 2.1. So we can see it's using the 2.1 bits. And so there's a couple of new features for pages. So I just remembered Zoom doesn't work, so you'll just have to, you can see pretty well from what I can tell. So we now support pages in areas. So I could go ahead and create an areas folder in here, and then we can watch the CS Proj live update. That's not particularly fun. So we can close this now, I guess. And we'll close the getting started page. And then inside here, I can add a pages folder. Okay, so remember areas are kind of like, sorry, I should add a named folder, so a named area. So we'll say like, you know, demo area. Then inside that particular area, I can add a pages folder. So remember these, like an area is kind of like a little microcosm right? So you have to replicate the layout that you would have elsewhere. So I would usually have a pages folder, so I'm going to put one in here. And then for the sake of simplicity, I will just copy and paste the index from the root of my app into here, and then I'll open up that one in the area, and I'll just delete the carousel because I really don't want the carousel there. And I'll put a heading here or something like this is from my demo area. So I'll need to obviously fix my model because I've copied code that's in the wrong spot. So we'll say this is now in .areas.demo.pages. This thing still won't find it because I haven't got a view imports that's setting the namespace of this file. So I could do a couple of things. I could just fully qualify this index model in here, or I could add a view imports like the one we have in the root that you can see sets the namespace to the folder. I'll just fully qualify it for the sake of making this simple. So I'll just copy that namespace, put that on the front of that. So now you can see it finds that index model. All right, so in theory now, and I'll get rid of all this noise so that we can, I should be able to run this and navigate to this page in that area. So this will behave exactly the way I hope you would expect it to. So once the app is running, it's going to launch to the home page. You can see it's HTTPS by default, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. I should be able to now go to the demo area and go and, oh, in theory, yeah, there you go. So like go to the demo area and it goes, yep, the index for that works, and this is from my demo area. So now we get pages and areas, just as working the way, as I said, I hope you would expect it would. So what else did we? Great. What else did we support? Where was my list of things to cheat? Support for pages shared. Now this is quite subtle. There's actually a little bit more that's going on with support for pages shared than first meets the eye. So everyone will know that we've had MVC has this convention of in the views folder you can have a shared folder, and then when you ask MVC to find a view or a partial by name, it will fall back to the shared location as the last place it looks. Okay, so it'll look in the very specific places first, based on the context in which you said, please find me the foo view. And if it doesn't find them there, it'll find them in the shared. Now, we didn't have that same support for pages, but very quickly after we shipped pages, people said, I want pages/shared. So we now support that, and you can see in here, we've got a shared folder in a template, and it has the cookie consent partial in it, which means that if you have an MVC view, for example, that is looking for a partial of this name, it'll first look inside the view hierarchy, including the shared folder. But then if it doesn't find that, it'll go and look inside the pages hierarchy and look inside its shared folder. So now you can, it just increases the ability to share assets between sort of traditional views and Razor pages, because you now have that shared convention there. Now, the other thing it does, though, which is kind of cool, is I can add a full-blown page in here. So I can add a Razor page. I can say shared page, right? And I'll go ahead and just add a heading again and just cheat and say, this is a shared page. Now, and so this isn't in the normal location. It's in the shared folder. And as I said, usually you treat the shared folder as a fallback. So what do we do with an asset that's actually routable? Remember, pages are routable. They get served. So how does this work? Well, this just acts as if it wasn't in the shared folder. Okay, so now I should be able to go to my app, and I should be able to actually just browse to shared page. Apps rebuilding. And it doesn't work. It explodes because I did something wrong. What did I do wrong? One of the devs hopefully is watching and will burst in here and tell me what I did wrong, or send me a text, because that should have worked. Let me force a rebuild, because that always fixes everything. When I did this demo in London, it worked perfectly. And now I'm trying it on this build. It doesn't work. What did I do wrong? Shared page. I have a page called shared page. I have a model. There's nothing in particular. This is all just a standard stuff. It all should just work, and it totally demo failed. That's unfortunate.
That reminds me, there was a NuGet package I used to use, but like a routing troubleshooter that would say, like, here's where troubleshooting routing is always.
That was MV. That was Phil's. Phil.
Oh yeah, going way back, and then I made some updates to it at one point. But yeah, that's because here it's like troubleshooting why specifically this didn't fire.
I know. It's just kind of annoying, actually. This totally worked when I did it last week, and now it's not working.
And there's no like namespace issue. That would be
no. So the whole point of how the shared pages work, right, is that anything in the shared folder that is a page will just project itself outside of that page into whatever parent folder it was in. So shared page should be routable from the root of the app, just like going to sort of the about page is. So I can go to the /about and it will load the about page. I should be able to go to shared page and it should load that. It's not working. So I'll go and talk to someone.
Nick was speculating it might be due to the area.
It shouldn't be, because areas are like a part of the are another thing as well. Like they have their own part of the root, right? So they have a thing called demo. It shouldn't matter at all. It should have no impact on any other page that you have. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. But one thing that you can do with areas, so the extension of this demo, which won't work now because this doesn't work, is that the fallback logic for finding pages supports overriding. And so you can do things like have a page in an area called demo. And then if that was brought in by a library, and Javier is going to show this stuff next week, you can override that in your app based purely on the fact that the paths to that view match. Okay, and then we have a very simple algorithm that says that when we try and find a view, if we find two assets with the same name at that path, then we will figure out which one wins based on basically which one is closer to your app. So what it effectively lets you do is have pages or partials or views in a library, or in a class library, in a NuGet package, or in an area.
And then override them.
Override them in your app by just popping them in your app in the pages folder or the area folder, if the library you brought in had it in an area, with the same name. And then it'll win. Because it'll go, oh, I have two, but you have one in your app, so that one wins, right? And so doing that, you get this really nice, simple composition model for providing UI and then overriding it. But Javier is going to do a bunch of demos on that next week. So I won't steal that thunder because his demos will be much better rehearsed and they won't fail like mine just did. So the couple other things on pages that I want to show, you can now bind all properties on the page. So when you do a page that takes parameters, so instead of doing it on get, say we wanted to add an on post here, right? And then we had a property to support binding like a customer or something. So I said, hey, I'm going to have a public customer model of some sort. So usually what I do is I do something like input model, and I declare a class in line, and I would call this input. And I would have a class down here. So that way I don't have to do a separate class for my, this model is only used by this page. What I would, you have whatever you want in here. Like you might have your ID property, and you have your string and your first name. And in your method, you're basically binding this thing, and then you are copying from whatever it was bound. Check your model validation, then copy that over to your EF model, whatever it is, or use AutoMapper or something along those lines. Yes, that's going to hate me for doing that. So what you can do now, previously, the way that this would work is you would mark this as bind property. Okay, so that means when a non-get request is made, please attempt to do a complex model binding operation based on this type onto this property. Now, in some pages, you might have more than one of these because you're doing named handlers, the thing that we briefly talked about before. So as well as on post, you might have like on post foo or fee and on post, bar, to handle different buttons on your pages, for example, or something like that. And you might want to bind different properties per method, or you just might have multiple properties that you want to bind for whatever reason. So now the very simple thing is we support putting this thing up here. So if you want to just bind everything on the page model, you can do that now. We initially had this in the prototype a few years ago. We decided to remove it. We said we'd wait for feedback. We got the feedback, people wanted it, so we've added that support now. So you can just decorate the entire page as saying, yep, I always want to bind everything on here. Don't make me do it property to property. And then the last thing that we got very strong feedback on was people wanted to be able to have code that ran before every handler or after every handler, right? And so in this example here, I've got a whole bunch of handlers, but there's no place to put common code other than the constructor. All right. So now page models all implement iPageFilter. So you can just override like on page handler executing, and you can run some code before any of these things run. Okay. And then similarly, you could override on page handler executed, and you can run code after. And like normal, like any other filter, right? You get a specific context and you can shortcut things, you can change the result, inspect, change, mutate, do whatever it is that you want to do. You could obviously put this code in an actual filter class and then you decorate it as an attribute on this page. But if you just want to run code in the page model just for this page before or after, you can now do that very easily because all page models implement iPageFilter.
So I was going to ask, why not just use the constructor, but for the on-page handler executed, that's an obvious thing, right?
Yeah, well, also, like, the constructor, you have absolutely no context about what's going to execute.
Right. Okay.
But obviously, this context tells you, well, I'm going to execute this action, or this handler. Like, these are the arguments that are going to be passed to the executing handler. This is the method I'm going to execute. You can change it, right? Like, this handler method descriptor is mutable. So you could go in here and say, well, it said it was going to execute the on post, but for whatever reason, I wanted to execute this other one, right? And you can do all this stuff in a page filter today, but now you can do it directly inside the page if that suits your scenario. Okay, so again, that was feedback we got about 2.0, and that's something you'll now be able to do in 2.1. This feature already exists in controllers, like the base controller class implements a filter so that you can just execute some code before or after any action method that runs on there. So it's basically supporting the same thing on here. Now, the other feature that is now meant to be in 2.1, but I just found out today that we botched it and accidentally it won't be in preview 1. It will be in preview 2, is the feedback that people want to be able to decorate these properties, simple properties here. So this is a bad example because that's a complex property. But if I had something like, this, right? This is quite common. Say you did like an on-get for a search page and you accept a filter or a query. You may want to say this is required. We don't have any support for doing that today because this was analogous to an action method parameter on an MVC controller. And you can't mark a parameter as required using the validation features, right? You can in 2.1. So now you could actually do this, and I could bring in the appropriate namespace for the data annotation. And that will now actually validate that when you run model validation for this page and say, well, if there's no valid value for filter, then this will throw. I mean, the little model state dictionary will contain an error. Unfortunately, the code to make this work in page model didn't land in preview 1. It's being done right now, so it'll be in the builds right after preview 1 because we're shutting down for preview 1, as I said. But it has landed in controllers. So if you want to use validation attributes on action methods in 2.1 preview 1, you will be able to do that, and you will be able to. And as I said, it's coming to page models. So yeah, they were the improvements I wanted to show. Sorry about the failure. I'm going to have to go off and figure out why that didn't work. Hopefully it's not a bug in the framework and it's just something I did that's wrong. But, at this stage, you never can tell. So let me stop.
Cool.
Are there any questions while I was doing that, or are they all just talking among themselves?
Let me see. There's so William Bossaker is asking, does it differentiate between get and post? I wonder if that's the required thing that you were talking about at the end.
Right. So as I said, we'd only bind properties. Even when you mark them with the attribute, they only get bound on non-get requests, but there is a parameter to the attribute that you can set which will make it bind for all request types. So again, that was just the default behavior that we chose. It's a convention. You can change it in the configuration of Razor Pages in your startup code. You can change that convention, but that's the convention we chose out of the box.
Cool. Let me see. Nick's saying he'd love to see a helper that all current parameters in the query changing in one reusable way, such as common sorting scenario thing in one column header and such. I'm not sure I parsed that.
So I query changing in a that's all the current parameters on the query changing one in a reusable way, such a common sorting scenario thing in common. I'm assuming. Okay, I think what he means is that there are scenarios where you do a get or a post to a page with say 4 query string parameters, and you want to render a result but change just one parameter.
Right, toggle ascending, descending.
Or, like for example, render a link, I should say, that uses the current thing but changes a single parameter. Yes, that scenario is a little cumbersome today. You basically have to reconstruct that thing. That's a really good suggestion. Nick, you should log that issue on the MVC repo, and we might even be, if it's well defined and fairly simple to do, we might even be able to put that in preview 2. So I'm not promising that, but that's a good one. I know I have struggled with that one myself. You also asked, is there any work happening on the SDK pileup? The previews are great, but the number of SDKs that get installed really starts to rack up even on just the VS previews, much less days. So I think what he is referring to is that if I go to like my apps and features section, if you're installing daily builds of SDKs, they're installs, right? And so you end up seeing them all in your list of stuff that's installed on your, on your machine. So if I share my screen again, we can see what this means. So I have up my apps and features from the Windows 10 settings app, and I've filtered .NET Core. So I have, .NET Core 1.15, the runtime, which comes with Visual Studio for the 1X apps. I have these SDKs, 202 and 203, which are, again, versions that come with Visual Studio. They were the releases up until November last year, so up until 15.5 of VS, I believe. Then they switched to the versioning of 2.1 for the SDK, which was very confusing, but we are retconning that over time. So these 2.12, 2.13, 2.14, these were, and you can see they were installed last year and earlier this year. These were releases that happened as part of our servicing for .NET Core 2. And then these releases here, 2.1.100, 2.1.100, and I think if you click on them, you get the full number. So 2.1.7.3.2.6 versus 7.3.5.4. These are the new versioning scheme that we're using for servicing of 2.0, .NET Core 2.0. And 2.1.300 is the version of the SDK that contains .NET Core 2.1. Now, it's all a bit weird now because, unfortunately, we did this versioning thing, as I said, where we went to 2.1 for the SDK before the runtime. That's not happening moving forward. So when 2.2 comes out, the SDK will be 2.2 and the runtime will be 2.2. And then the patch number, the third number of the SDK, has its own versioning scheme that encapsulates both feature changes and patches. And so it basically goes up by 100 when there is a feature level change. So, 2.1.100 is a patch for the 2.0 sort of product. It's the 2.0 SDK effectively. And 300 is the SDK for .NET Core 2.1. Okay, so if we do a patch for that, it'll be 3.01 and 3.02. But if we have to add a new, support to a new version of C# or a new version of NuGet, that would go up to 2.1.400. But when 2.2 of .NET Core comes out, the whole SDK will move to 2.2. Whatever. So the 2.1 release is always going to be a little weird because it straddles both the 2.0 runtime and the 2.1 runtime. So you do need a bit of a decoder ring, but moving forward after that, it will get a lot clearer. So to Nick's point, yeah, I have a lot of builds. So I've installed 1, 2, 3, 4 of those new build types I talked about on this machine. And so I have, 8016, 8026, 8118, and 8019 all on this machine. Now, that's because the SDK installation behavior is side-by-side. That was the choice that was made. It's one of the sort of tenet features of .NET Core is that installs are side-by-side, so that there's always a chance for you to, after you do an install, if you do find something wrong, you can modify a project to pin yourself to an earlier version of the SDK. Now, we all know the runtimes are side-by-side, right? There's a folder, it has the runtime in it, it has a version name, so they're always side-by-side. And the SDK installs include the runtime, but the SDK, like the command line tools, .NET Blah themselves, are also side-by-side by default, but we do roll you forward to the newest one by default. That's why you end up with them all in your add remove programs list. If you pave your machine and install again from scratch, you'll generally just install the latest one and then you'll just have that one installed again, right? And if you don't want the previous ones, you can always go and safely uninstall the previous one after you've installed the new ones. And the installers should be authored, correctly, fingers crossed, so that if you uninstall a previous version, it doesn't, stuff up the new one that you just installed because it does the right ref counting and all that type of thing. So, Nick, if that's a super concern for you, you should be able to uninstall. It's a supported scenario of all earlier versions, and assuming that you don't have a global JSON that pins a particular project to that specific version that you want installed, there shouldn't be any ramifications of that. But I do appreciate that for folks who just want to be on the latest, it does result in those things. It's an extra step required. You have to uninstall the previous one.
We did get a few more interesting questions come in. So Talon's asking, on a related note, any plans for a DMVM-like tool to come back into focus?
Lots of talk, no firm plans. There's a lot of talk about, we talked about the scenario we just showed, right, was using in like OS level installers to install this stuff. But we know some folks like to use, like on Linux, you'll often use apt-get, like their package management system to get it. Or you might just want tar files or zip files. Then you want some command line you can use to easily acquire runtime updates or SDK updates or switch to a different version. Yes, it's been talked about. DMVM functionally was pretty good. The way it was implemented was a little less suboptimal, I think. Changed your path and had all these options for global changing versus current session versus user and stuff. The biggest issue is when you cross the streams. So if you install using the exe, which registers itself in add remove programs, for example, like we just showed there, add remove features, and it becomes like a program files level install, that requires administrator privileges, right? If I go to the command line and say .NET install a runtime, well, do you expect that to elevate? Like, do you expect it to detect that you're running with a version of .NET that was originally installed in program files on Windows, for example, and that if you try and install a new runtime, that it should say, well, you can't because you're not running as an admin because it wants to put it next to it? Well, that won't show up in admin programs because it wasn't built using MSI, right? Or would it be okay to have that command install runtimes to a different place? But then when you say, like, list me the runtimes, it has to know about all the places that it might find runtimes, right? Like, oh, you've got it in your user hive here, plus you've got the global ones you've installed, and maybe you have some runtimes just in the current repo because the .NET CLI does include some features for like discovering things just in the current folder in the with the .NET folder. It gets really complicated. So we've talked about a lot of that stuff, but there might be a proposal that I haven't read yet, but I don't think there's any firm plans yet, but it is being talked about.
Cool. Kyle's asking for updates on performance, specifically on data access work.
Yeah, so I just came out of that meeting before here. So we meet on that weekly. So we've been working very closely with the community owner of MPG SQL. So and internally with the SQL client team. And so we've been focusing on the Tech and Power Fortunes framework, Fortunes benchmark, I should say. Fortunes is the benchmark that does some data access and then renders the results into some HTML and sends it back. And traditionally, all of the Fortunes tests that we have submitted have all been roughly the same score, which suggests that, but they shouldn't be. Like, we have like a middleware that uses ADO.NET directly versus one that uses Dapper versus one that uses EF. And then we have versions that use MVC and Razor. And so there should be a good spread because we know all of those things add overhead, but they're all about the same when they run on Tech and Power, which means that they're being bottlenecked by something common, and it turns out it's the database access. And so we've made some really good progress in that area, seeing multiple times throughput improvements. That is all being tracked publicly. You can go and see it. There's a GitHub repo under the ASP.NET org, and it is called, I think it's, if I type in data in the search, it's called Data Access Performance. And so all the work that we've been doing and issues and like recording notes and stuff is happening in that repo, and it is public. I can tell you that with the current experimental sort of builds of MPG SQL, we think we're going to, based on the Fortunes Tech and Power, we think we're going to jump from being nowhere close to being a contender to top 5, maybe even better. That's our hope. So that's looking really good. And then we've worked closely with the SQL client team to help identify some bottlenecks that they've had in their Linux client. And I got told today that a fix has gone in, which has completely removed that bottleneck. So we expect to see some good improvements for folks using SQL client on Linux as well. And then from there, we're going to continue. This is just focused on Fortune so far, which is the read-only benchmark, because we have to start somewhere. And then from that, we'll probably move into the update benchmark to figure out what are the set of issues we have to tackle in terms of performance when doing updates over ADO.NET on Postgres and SQL. But we've made really, really good progress.
Very cool. Okay, and then Meher is asking, why was the ASP.NET Core module GitHub repo deprecated by ASP.NET IIS integration repo?
I didn't know it was. I could take a guess. Let's have a look. Where does it say it's deprecated? I'm looking at the ASP.NET Core module repo. I don't see anything about it being deprecated in here. Why ASP.NET Core module repo was deprecated by IIS integration? I don't know. Meher, can you elaborate on what you mean by that? They're both separate components. Unless they've moved all the ASP.NET Core module code into IIS integration. Maybe they have. What I can say is that as part of 2.1, we've done work in the ASP.NET Core module to separate out the two, basically to split the module into 2 parts. The problem with IIS modules is they have to be installed globally, which means that when we wanted to make a change, they're singletons. So when we wanted to make a change to the ASP.NET Core module, the problem was that it was very risky, right? If we make a change there, it affects every ASP.NET Core app running on that machine, okay? So in 2.1, what we've done is we've split that. So now what we have, the ASP.NET Core module has effectively become a shim that can include, it's basically freezing in time the current status of the ASP.NET Core module, but also supports finding the other half of itself inside the deployed application. So you can effectively bin deploy the actual functional part of the ASP.NET Core module with your application, like literally the native code. So that means that we can now make changes to the ASP.NET Core module native part, the bit that integrates deeply with IIS, version to version without danger of affecting all the other apps running on the machine. It's just that it's more of the same, right? Getting side-by-side support allows us to make, to move fast and break things without breaking everything, which is super important. So that might be what they're referring to. I'm looking at looking at the last commit in the ASP.NET Core module. I'm looking at it and it says create issue template. Maybe Stripe is saying this repo is, so this repo is obsolete, move it here. So it looks like they may have just moved the code. So because of the change that I just talked about, we basically consider the ASP.NET Core module and the IIS integration all part of the same product. So it seems like they've made the choice just to move it all into one repo. And for example, it means they build together. They always build together as part of the same unit now because there is tight integration between the two. So I think it's just a case of code moving around. There's nothing to be alarmed about. We're just moving these things into one repo so that they're always together. We can report issues, we can code on them together, and they can get built together.
Cool.
So no other questions, I see.
Looks like it.
All right. Well, as I said, next week, I won't be here. It'll be the morning session, and I'll be off in that meeting. But Javier will be here to talk about... Actually, I'll be on holiday next week. It's midwinter break, so I'll be in San Diego. I'm coming to see you, John. Hang out for a week. And Javier will be in to talk about the Razor in a class library feature. And he'll demonstrate how we utilize that to improve our default identity and sort of authentication story in the templates as well, having a lot less code in your application. So tune in next week to watch that.
Very exciting.
Otherwise, we lock on me for the
lock on you.
Ever dramatic zoom out.
We are locked on you.
Is this the right button? No, that was the wrong button. What about this button? That's the
dramatic zoom out. It's so dramatic.